Um, okay, so I guess to start off, um, let me give a little background about why this was interesting to me. Um, I grew up with hippie parents, generally not the most fond of authority, and I didn't realize, well, I guess I realized it, but when I began getting into teaching a little, um, the clear hierarchy and dynamics in the classroom became very evident to me. And it was a way that, so when I started looking into different ways to deal with grading, it seemed like this was a great way to change the culture in the classroom, and to make it more collaborative in nature. So that is really my motivation behind learning more about this topic. Um, so the essential question that I'm trying to tackle, and then we will see if I do it effectively. But what I want to think about, what sort of learning environment do letter grades create in school? And if you don't love that kind of environment, well, what are some different approaches we can take to combat it? Um, and before kind of jumping into anything else, I just want to be clear about what I plan to tackle and what I don't plan to tackle in this, because I don't have an ample amount of teaching experience dealing with these different techniques. They're kind of more something that I've come across lately, and I'm very interested in implementing in the future. So with that said, um, I'm not going to be able to give you exact details on how to implement it, all the big problems that will come along with it, how to solve them. I've read about other people's anecdotes regarding that. So I may be able to speak to it a little. And I will do my best to answer what I know. But in terms of firsthand experience with a lot of these, I don't have that much of it. But I've been reading a lot about it. Um, so one of the goals here is to give you evidence that traditional grading techniques may be harmful in some ways. Um, and I want to expose you to potential alternatives to traditional grading techniques. And then if one of those techniques is especially interesting to you, um, I have a bunch of resources at the end of this webinar that may be helpful. Um, so feel free to take a look at those. And we're going to make the slides available to everyone too. But the things I don't want you to take away, or I'm not trying to do with this webinar, is I'm not trying to say these traditional grading techniques serve no purpose ever, or they just should never be used. That is definitely not my goal. Um, I'm not here to say that one approach is definitively better than the other either. Um, these all kind of have, it really depends what you want to build in your classroom. And then these are different tools that you can use. Also, all of these techniques that I will be discussing, we are in a system where we have to often provide grades. So a lot of it's about reframing, and you're still giving grades, but it becomes more collaborative in nature with your students on how to do that. And again, just to reiterate this point, I'm not going to go into extreme detail about how to execute a lot of these alternate grading techniques. But if like the resources may be more helpful in that, I'll give an overview of them. And if there's a few that are very kind of intriguing to some of you, I would be happy to kind of do a much deeper dive in a future webinar, if that would be of interest. So I'm going to just kind of take a moment, and if you give this thought some, think about this, feel free to share in chat, feel free to not share at all, feel free to share out loud, totally up to you. But think about your own experiences in school with letter grading, or that's as a student or educator, and kind of think about what effect did it have on you. Did it breed a certain mentality about school, about learning? Was it enjoyable, boring? What were the effects of it? Um, so let's just take a minute to think about it. And again, you don't have to share. You can share in whatever way you feel comfortable. But let's just give it some thought. So Brittany says, obsessive, perfection or nothing. Can't graduate with a C in graduate school. So anything less than an A creates anxiety, 100%. It puts focus on results versus process. Yep, the competitiveness that it instilled wasn't very fun. I like learning, but not rote learning. Percentage is better if you're doing well. Okay, so I cannot tell. This is exactly so. These fall in line with my ideas about this as well. I'm going to talk about how your ideas about this actually fall in line with the research on it as well. Essentially, we are discussing about what do we think schools should do? I mean, do you want to create learning? As you get, I can only speak for myself, but as I got older, I found out that I really do like learning about new subjects and topics. But school, I never liked school. I didn't do particularly great at school. It felt like a chore, and that sounds, and Brittany, you said obsessiveness. It does create this like, there's so much tied to reaching perfection and not focusing on the process of learning, which is really perhaps the most important part of it. So thank you for sharing that. So I found this video and I think it does a really, really nice job of not only talking about the history of why we grade in the way we do, but some of the detrimental effects it can have, and who it's catering to. So it is 8 minutes, so strap in, but I think it's well worth your time to take a look. So I'm going to play this now. Let me know if you can hear. Can you hear that? Good. Okay.
We all remember the dreaded end of semester Armageddon known as report card day, but why do we get letter grades in school at all? So getting grades is a big part of the way we view education, with A's equaling success while F's represent the dreaded failure. Students are taught early on that to get ahead in life and be smart and successful, the best foundation is getting perfect report cards in school. Grades can help us get into advanced courses and competitive colleges, and certain exams can grant us licenses to practice different professions and trades. But outside of the nagging question about why we skipped over the E grade, have you ever wondered when were the first grades given and why? Well, if you want to blame someone, it appears that the first grades date back to Yale President Ezra Stiles in 1785. He wrote in his diary that there were 58 students present at his examination and that their grades were 20 optimi, 16 second optimi, 12 inferiores boni, and 10 pejores. These are usually noted as the first college grades ever assigned. In Yale's 1813 to 1839 record of examinations, students' averages were noted in the book by the senior tutor of the class on a scale of 4, which may be responsible for the 4.0 scale commonly used today. In 1817, the faculty reports from William and Mary College grouped students into 4 categories. Number 1, the first in their respective classes. Number 2, orderly, correct, and attentive. Number 3, they have made very little improvement. And number 4, they have learned little or nothing. Ouch, that's a major teacher burn, but the 4.0 scale wasn't really standardized throughout the 19th century. Harvard tried a 100-point scale and then a 20-point scale. Yale later tried a 9-point scale. So until 1850, it was normal for grades to vary in terms of number systems and weight. And in US colleges, professors used descriptive adjectives to assign value rather than relying on numbers alone. But by 1883, there's a report on a Harvard professor giving a student a B grade, which is when letters got incorporated into the act. And in 1886, Harvard faculty record shows that professors began grouping students into 5 classes based on performance. Similar 5-point systems spread to places like Yale and Mount Holyoke, the latter of which adopted the first letter grade system in 1897, but a failing grade was marked as an E and not an F. Over time, the E was dropped, and the standard system across U.S. colleges became 5 points, all represented by letters A through D and F. But the meaning of grades and the system for recording them often shifted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Okay, so we've established that if we want somewhere to point the finger of blame for why we receive stressful grades in school and why a less than stellar score on a 6th grade pop quiz gave me heart palpitations, we can start with a bunch of 19th century college professors. But the more important question is, why are we still getting grades in school today? So they're useful for determining class ranking, and they can help teachers group students into categories, and they can also be instrumental in whether or not you can enter into certain jobs. But because I'm sure a lot of us are still suffering from post-report card-induced stress, we have to ask the most pressing questions. Do grades really matter? And are they actually effective tools for helping students learn? Well, the answer to the first question, do grades really matter, is kind of complex and has to be broken down a bit to get to the heart of it, because it seems that the importance of your grades depends on the path you decide to take. Although we're taught that grades are the strongest predictor of success in life, this isn't uniformly true. The issue with grades is that they consider averages, which gives you the most usual outcome, but not the full picture. An average doesn't consider the outliers, but rather the collective information from a certain group. History is actually filled with successful people who didn't finish college or even high school. Magic Johnson, Anna Wintour, Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, and Oprah Winfrey, to name a few. And none of these people did too shabbily in the life success department. Also, having perfect grades in high school doesn't always predict future game changers. Karen Arnold of Boston University conducted a study in which she followed 81 high school valedictorians and salutatorians. She found that the majority of them continued being successful at school later in life. 95% earned college degrees with an average GPA of 3.6. 60% went to graduate school, 90% earned professional jobs, and 40% earned the highest tiers of those jobs. This is because a high GPA reflects skills like being prompt, working really hard, following directions, and being well-rounded. All important skills for high-level careers. But Arnold found that although most of her former high school valedictorians and salutatorians were strong occupational achievers, none had entered into roles she would consider visionary, because the grades we receive in high school are designed to reward conformity and following the rules, rather than creative thinking or specialization. For example, if you're really great at history, shout out to our audience members, but you still want to be ranked number 1, you eventually will have to put that history textbook on the back burner to study other subjects and earn that coveted A in every field. Having a high GPA is usually indicative of being a generalist, not a specialist. Arnold posits that most people who become groundbreakers are actually rewarded for creative thinking, a unique specialization, and a focus on an intellectual passion, things that don't always get rewarded with grades. As a result, a lot of people who become successful later in life often struggle in school. But a 2002 study at the University of Michigan still found that 80% of students based their self-worth on how well they were doing in school, and students with lower grades reported having lower self-esteem and health. So that brings us to the next question. Do grades really help students learn? Although grades have long been considered the standard approach in education, some experts are turning away from letter-based systems. One of the biggest critics of the fixation on grades in schools is education expert Alfie Kahn. Kahn notes, the research quite clearly shows that kids who are graded and have been encouraged to try to improve their grades tend to lose interest in learning itself, avoid challenging tasks whenever possible in order to maximize the chance of getting an A, and think less deeply than kids who aren't graded. That's why the best teachers in schools replace grades and grade-like reports with narrative reports, qualitative accounts of student performance, or better yet, conferences with students and parents. Teachers also report that grading is becoming increasingly stressful, as grade inflation puts added pressure on them to deliver the grades that students want and parents expect. Some educators are moving away from letter and number-based grading to standards-based grading. In 2013, Kentucky implemented a system where students received 2 report cards, one with traditional letter grades and another with an individualized breakdown of what students had learned and the students' progress in school. Virginia's Fairfax County implemented a similar process in their elementary schools in 2012 and 2013. Parents reported finding the new system initially confusing, but ultimately more helpful in assessing their child's growth and progress in school. And classrooms around the world, including public schools, private schools, and educational initiatives funded by nonprofits, are looking to incorporate new methods and in the classroom that place less emphasis on memorization and focus more on innovation and how students can retain new knowledge. So even though grades are the oldest way of doing things, they may not be the best for measuring students' long-term success. So how does this all add up? It seems like grades do have some weight in determining student outcomes precisely because we base so many systems around them, but this can vary a lot based on the individual. While grades are extremely important in certain trajectories, like going to college, attending graduate school, or entering into certain professions, they ultimately aren't the only determining factor of success. And although we've accepted them as the marker of a good student, a perfect GPA doesn't always represent things like creativity, ingenuity, and intellectual passions, which is why more school systems and educators are looking for ways to measure student progress outside of letters and percentages. So, what do you think? Have any other theories about how grades became so entrenched in our education system? Drop all your comments and questions down below. We swear we won't ask you to share any of your old report cards, and we'll see you next week. Hey everyone, if you like the origin.
Okay, so thank you for bearing with me during that 8-minute video, but I think it does a really nice job of talking about why we have them and then the potential shortcomings of it, and some of the research behind it as well, behind those shortcomings. So based on a meta-analysis, which is kind of a look at all the studies that have looked at this topic, and kind of what have they kind of taken away from it. So this is obviously focused on the negative parts of it, but a lot of you expressed similar kind of concerns when we were talking about it before. So they found that traditional grading can reduce students' inherent interest in learning the topic. Students were less likely to challenge themselves when they know their grade is on the line. That makes sense, right? Less likely to display critical thinking skills when they're being graded. And two kind of other things is, one, it may act as a catalyst for cheating and cutting corners. Again, that's focusing on, because we're so focused on that outcome rather than the process. And also, we kind of view these grades as very objective and standardized without really acknowledging the fact that, inherently these are somewhat subjective by the teacher. So that has to be grasped, dealt with in some way. That has to be acknowledged, I should say. So again, this is just going to the idea that traditional grading becomes so outcome focused that we can kind of lose more important lessons along the way. And again, to talk about this again, is these techniques are upheld for a variety of reasons, but just a few of them. So it's a form of standardization because it's universally recognized. Because of that, they're fairly easy to interpret from one school to another, from one administration to another. And another one is, it feels like the primary leverage educators have over our students. Like it gives the educator power. And I'd argue that all of these reasons are the reasons why traditional grading is upheld is often to center the either educator's voice or the administrative voices rather than the people we should be serving. So my hope is when I came across these other traditional grading techniques, I think they do a better job of focusing on the student a bit more and trying to meet them where they're at instead of focusing on what our standard of a topic should be and having them meet us there. So this is just a list of the alternate grading techniques that I came across. And it's not like a pick one and then they're not mutually exclusive. So when we talk about ungrading, for example, that's a bigger framework that you can implement metacognitive learning in. So they're some of them are a bit larger than others. It's more than anything, it's a framing of your class that helps students kind of be more motivated to participate in some way. Um, have people heard of gamification? I don't know if you have, but it's something I came across recently, and it is really, really interesting. So what it is, it's an educational approach to motivate students to learn by using game design elements in a learning environment. Put simply, is you're essentially turning your learning outcomes into a game in some way. So imagine that you want to develop some certain skill, and mastering that skill is almost like beating a boss, for example. And you kind of along the way, you give certain badges or points, or you incentivize them achieving these skills along the way. So they feel like they're making progress. So in our PFF class, someone did a gamification teaching lesson. It was really cool. So I'm in a, I'm part of the positive developmental psychology program, and she was as well. And in positive psychology, there's this thing we talk about, a strength-based approach, which is you're really focusing on your kind of best attributes and how you can contribute using those. So to teach that to the students, what she did was she kind of framed your strengths as a superpower and made a game so you have to use that superpower to defeat this monster. So that would be an example of gamification. So you're turning your class, you're reframing your class into kind of a game-like scenario with your students. And so why would you implement it? It shows a lot, it helps student motivation a lot. So they become more autonomous in their own learning. Changes how students frame schoolwork a lot, so it doesn't feel like a chore as much. Um, and again, a gate engagement, and you're looking for ways to really maximize student learning outcomes. So what they tend to find is that your students become more engaged in the material when you're reframing your lessons in this way. Um, and it is not something that is only in education. It's been it's been implemented in corporate training as well. So on the left, you can kind of see some of the statistics behind it, and I think it is a really interesting trend that's coming up. Um, it definitely takes a lot of creativity and work to because it is such a radical shift regarding kind of how we traditionally do learning. Um, just a few things. They found 60% increase in engagement, 43% enhance in productivity. It is something that's becoming increasingly popular, and I think it is. I would be surprised if it isn't here to stay. But again, on the educator's part, it definitely takes a lot of work to kind of create this. Um, Ungrading, something that I became really interested in um, because it is a probably the most radical kind of approach, I think. Essentially, what it is you're still giving grades, but your grades are being largely dictated by your students. So, what I mean by that is your students and you kind of come together, and your student says, I think I deserve a B. And then the teacher says, yeah, I think I agree with that. Or I think you deserve better, or I think you deserve worse. Um, from what I've read about this, anecdotally at least, students tend to, I think the concern is, oh, they're just going to all ask for A's. Um, from what I've read, it's usually an actual pretty normal distribution in terms of grades. And more than anything, people tend to underestimate how well they deserve to do, at least according to the teachers. Um, so really, these grades become a collaborative effort. Um, and the benefit here is that you're trying to really get rid of that intense focus on the outcome, and you're focusing heavily on the process. So what that means is what the teacher kind of lacks in kind of giving back those grades, they're focusing a lot on giving back feedback, formative feedback. So from what I've read on the topic, you're really focusing on giving intense feedback on every assignment you have. And there's not as much anxiety from the student's perspective on what the grade is, because you'll come to that when you'll come to that. But what I want to do is I want to see you master these skills. Here's how you can do it. So why you may implement it, you don't believe grades are a good indicator of learning. I think this is one of the best approaches of kind of getting rid of that hierarchy in your classroom and becoming almost a peer with your students. And you really want to approach that, focus more on providing feedback. And why I say this is kind of one of the more radical approaches, I think, is because it challenges a lot of deeply held assumptions about education. So how do grades make your students feel? Are grades helpful to students? If there are no grades, what would education look like? Do they assist in skill development? And is there a better way to evaluate? And so all these questions, ungrading was basically created in response to these questions, essentially. And I can say on my part, it is definitely something I plan to implement in the future. I think it's a really interesting approach to education. Any questions so far? Okay, feel free to drop it in chat if you do have any. Okay, so this is a different approach that is also available to people is, and this is really something that may be appealing to you if you are building a class that's developing one particular skill. So continuous summative practices. So for example, in the past, I've taught research methods. And if the goal of that class was to learn how to write a research paper, then everything about the class would be framed in the way of, all right, we're developing skills to get to that point. And why this is a little bit different from traditional grading techniques is because, again, it's really deeply focused on feedback, formative feedback rather than summative, because you're building towards a certain skill. So it's a different way of framing the class. And I think it is very useful if whatever you're teaching, you think there's one thing that really needs to be mastered within it. So every assignment you have, you're not really grading it necessarily. Maybe you'll give a complete, incomplete, but the focus of it is developing the skills to kind of reach this final destination. And there's a question regarding ungrading. Does ungrading still seem to incorporate and utilize rubrics? From my understanding, it doesn't. So what I have seen is when in that video it talked about narrative approaches. So I've seen it take that approach, meaning when you come together with your teacher, you and them will discuss what was your learning process like? Like, tell me what you knew before, what you worked towards during this whole class, and they may write something up, giving you a description of their journey through the class and what they've done, what they haven't done. And with that information, they come together and decide on a grade ultimately. So there wasn't, from the accounts I've read about it, I haven't seen rubrics utilized in that way. Does that help answer? And any other questions, please? Great. Okay. One more comment. Yeah, of course. My pleasure. So a standards-based approach. So this is, again, a different way of framing what we're trying to do in classes. So again, this is talked a little bit about in the video I showed, but rather than providing letter grades, educators provide feedback on students' level of mastery of certain learning outcomes. So what that means, it's turning these letter grades into something that you may think is kind of nebulous into very concrete definitions of what does it mean to be an A student? What does that look like? So if we're talking about riding a bicycle, that may look like popping a wheelie down some highway. I mean, that seems psychotic, actually. Don't do that. But if you were to take that approach, I'd say you're a master in that. So you're turning all these letter grades into a very specific, observable outcome. And why would you implement it? Because you can more clearly identify trends in your classroom. So let's say the majority of your students lose their balance on the bicycle. Well, it gives you very clear feedback on what you need to kind of focus on in your classroom. So it becomes easier to really identify this is where my class is struggling and this is what I need to do to fix that. If you can explicitly tie your kind of evaluations to your student learning outcomes, it is a good approach, because what this approach really requires is you having a very explicit, observable understanding of what mastery looks like. And in that case, it becomes very clear to the student what you're looking for and what you're trying to develop. And if you're trying to develop something that they find kind of useless, well, you'll probably hear about that. Either, I don't know, hopefully during class, mid-semester feedbacks. It's a way to be very transparent about your students, about what the class is, what it isn't, what you're looking for. Um, and I think it's just a way to make your class more meaningful in that way. It's the way it's explicit to your students is helpful, and it's very transparent, which I think is really important. So to give you an example, this is an example I found online about just something you may, a standards-based approach. So advanced understanding meets the standard, yada, yada, yada. And then we have these very clear definitions about what that looks like. So again, there's an explicitness and transparentness about what the class is and it isn't. Another approach, I think we use this in PFF, and I think it is really, really helpful if it fits in with your overall goals on the class. So I don't know if you've heard of digital portfolios. I think they're pretty popular in art, maybe, I think. So a digital portfolio is you're asking your students to kind of collect material throughout the class, either things they've built themselves, things they find valuable in your classroom. And I think, from when we conduct the PFF classes, the reason we take this approach is because we want people to come out of the class with skills and techniques and frameworks that they will implement a year, 2 years down the line, when they begin teaching. This isn't something we want, just you show mastery now and forget about it. If you think that you're building a class that is really useful for your students down the line over the course of their lives, and you want them to kind of explicitly, intentionally build and think about what it is about this class that is useful, this is a really good approach, because you're asking your students to curate whatever they find of value in the class and organize it in some way that makes sense to them. And then, down the line, they can easily access that. And because most classes you take notes, and I wasn't super organized, and then you kind of wish you had the takeaways from that class, and they're kind of nowhere to be found. And then maybe if you want to relearn that subject, well, you actually have to relearn it rather than having all those ideas kind of culminated in some area wherever it is, on digital platforms, etc. So why would you implement it? Again, it allows students to easily access course content and their own work over a longer period of time. Just the online aspect and the ability to kind of navigate those online systems kind of helps create future focused skills. Um, I think definitely one of the biggest benefits is it intentionally asks your students to think about what it is in your class that is important. Like if they were building this class, what should be the student learning outcomes? What is important in this class? Um, and then for their own satisfaction, if their own work is involved, it allows students to kind of see their progression through the class and recognize that hopefully they've made change along the way. Um, but there's a lot of different kind of approaches within this as well. Um, so you may if showcase digital portfolio. So if you think you want to create a class, let's say an art class, and you want them to create a portfolio for future jobs or for gallery viewings, well, that may be an approach. If you really want to see their growth throughout a period of time, a process digital portfolio would be really helpful. And this is the assessment one, which is definitely more formal and less student centered. Um, that's kind of just a collection of all the stuff together, and that's more in line with kind of a traditional approach. But in PFF, we just ask kind of students to collect what they found of value and put that together in what way makes sense, and then we help them along the way kind of clarify certain things if it was unclear. So then a few years down the line, they still have access to it and they can look at that. Finally, the metacognitive approach. And I've seen, again, this is something that I've seen definitely in the ungrading. So when I said they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, this is an example of it. So metacognitive learning is you're taking an approach that what I want to develop in this classroom is I want my students to think about how they learn themselves. How would they think about their thinking, essentially? So more so than kind of developing a certain outcome, you're trying to have students think about how they think, how they learn, and how to kind of maximize that ability. So why would you implement it? If you specifically value teaching students to critically think and about developing their thinking, so I think in college I took a critical thinking class, and we definitely utilize a lot of these approaches. Um, what am I doing at this moment? There's a test coming up. What did I do to study for that test? How can we do that better? When I thought about this moral problem, what were the premises that I was kind of basing my judgment on? So it's really focusing on self-awareness and critical thinking in your classroom. And like I said, for the ungrading approach, at least the accounts I've read about it, they tend to use this a lot in terms of, well, when I asked you to complete this assignment, take me through your process of how did you prepare for that? What did you look at? And then you come together with the teacher and you focus on really like personal development. So I think in some ways, and again, this can be implemented in a lot of these different approaches, but I guess my idea of what schools should be, you're going to want to incorporate these type of things. You want to create a lifelong learner, not just someone that can show temporary masterment and mastery of whatever it is you're teaching. So are there any questions about any of that? All right, great. Okay, so, and just to give you an example of kind of how this may look like in practice. So you're kind of thinking through everything along the way. And then after you complete something, you evaluate. It's just constant reflection. So I think that's just a very valuable thing in life in general. Okay, so that is the approaches I came across, but this is certainly not all encompassing. Um, Again, feel free to just think about, or feel free to share in chat or out loud. Um, are there any, as an educator, how have you combated these traditional kind of letter grades? How have you tried to? If you never had, is there a certain approach or that is kind of the most appealing to you?
Hi,
Hey,
Brittany Bowerly. Nice to meet you.
hi,
Thanks.
Britt. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, so I actually haven't been an educator as of yet. I am planning on taking the preparing future faculty coursework. Although I'm in HR and I'm looking at this and I'm seeing how all this translates to how you approach your staff, right? It's like it's so parallel. It's really neat. You know, we learned that taking the point system alpha performance evaluations actually makes people perform better. You sit down, you
Oh,
give
really?
regular feedback, right? You have the qualitative conversations instead of a point scale. So it's really cool. And then of course I've seen professors use a couple of these in some of the courses I've taken and how different it made my learning, you know,
Right. Yeah.
opposed to
Yeah.
focusing and obsessing about the grade.
So, regarding the point system you were talking about, was the idea behind that in HR training just if I tie this to a point system, we're talking about self-worth now. Like I'm tying your self-worth to this point system rather than just saying, hey, we can do this better. Let's just focus on that. It doesn't feel
Right.
so judgmental.
Exactly, but it's so hard to train managers to use a qualitative system because they were so used to, well, you know, if they get a 3, that means they're performing better than expected. If they get a 2, that's average. If they get a, you know, and I was just like, what? It doesn't have to be like that. Like if you're really paying attention to what your staff is doing, you know what they're doing well and what they can improve on. So have that conversation. But everyone's so scared of being, you know, confrontational or and that's how they see it. So you got to retrain them and reframe it to rather than confrontation, it's a conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that this point system you're talking about in terms of, and this in education is letter grades. But this is where like people have obsessiveness because they're tying these points to their self-worth.
Right.
So it becomes bigger than it is. And it is not acknowledging the inherent truth about education is part of it is being wrong and building like all of like that it should be part of your class. If you're teaching class where everyone knows everything, well, you're not challenging them enough.
Right. And
So
they're wasting their
making
money to be there.
failure okay is really important.
Yeah.
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 Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Anybody else? Great. Okay, so before I kind of show you how to stay in contact with PFF, I'm going to throw on this poll, just kind of seeing who joined, how did you like it, yada, yada, yada. So it should take a few seconds, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. And thank you for attending.
I don't see my school here at CGU. Maybe I'm missing it because of all these letters. I'm used to just seeing it as DBOS.
Yes, we do. I
That
don't
would
think we
be
have.
SSSPE.
Got it.
Thanks.
So Joseph asked, does university accept these grading systems? So, yeah, thank you for asking. This is super important. Again, I want to reiterate, that a lot of these approaches do end up with final grades. So for example, like the most radical approach I think is ungrading. So even though that's a radical approach, you're ending up with a final grade in that you're coming together with your student and saying, here's what we've kind of agreed upon. And these other approaches I talked about, it's more a kind of reframing of what grading means rather than not giving a grade. Because as you said, I haven't come across a university that, at least in my teaching experience, or I haven't really heard of one, um, that just ditches grades immediately. So it's finding a way to create grading systems that work within a system that is oppressive in some ways. I hope that helps.
Noah, can I jump in
Yeah.
and add?
Yeah.
Because yes, I teach and we do the whole grades thing, but I guess I've taken sort of this hybrid approach, and I've used it with developmental writing students and freshman comp, and it's a way to help them sort of calibrate and understand how to get the grade that they want.
Yeah.
And so having these conversations, and to speak to your point about when students are grading themselves, you're absolutely right. I've never had anyone grade too high, but I always give them a 5-point differential. So like, if you're in the ballpark, right, we're going to go with it. And students, yeah, they've been either dead on or they have graded themselves a little bit lower than I would have graded them.
Really?
But also helping them understand how they're grading themselves. You know, if I say, okay, whatever your grade is, or whatever grade you think this is, tell me why you think that. And so and it's kind of a package deal. You know, you can't just like push it out and say, try it. There's scaffolding. It can't be like a final assignment. It has to be timed when they understand like what they're doing and how things are scaffolded. And it, you know, so I think, you know, we don't have to necessarily ditch the whole grading system, because, you know, as educators and adjuncts, we can't do that. But I think there are ways to fit in this kind of thinking so that they're not fixated on grades. And for my students, because it's writing, I have a really open revision policy. So I'm like, all right, it's a 75. Well, if you want to keep going and keep trying, here are the things you need to do. So just revise, do these things, add to your paper, and get those additional points that you want. And it changes the way they work. So, you know, it's a little bit of that gamification, a little metacognition, like, why is your grade the way it is? Because that's one thing I would hear a lot from students. I would get C's on my papers and I don't know why. So I think it's important to help them understand, you know, even, I know there was a question earlier about rubrics, and I've used them as not necessarily for grading, but to say, okay, here's where your skills are right now, and you just need to get to this point. And it helps them understand, like, okay, I need to, you know, use more, you know, longer, more complex sentences. So I think rubrics can be used carefully in a way that helps them understand what else they need to do, not what they didn't do right. And it's a subtle change, but it makes a difference, I think.
Yeah, that's so helpful to hear that since you actually did it. Yeah, because it sounds like you're giving your students more autonomy in their own learning, which makes a night and day difference, I would imagine. How about in schools? Engaging students with these strategies in college helps, but what about younger students in schools? That is a great question. Does anyone want to speak to that? Because I don't have any experience K through 12. And I know there's for sure a lot more constraints in that teaching in that. I mean, I would just say, I imagine you may not be able to, you don't have as much autonomy in shifting that, I would imagine, in K through 12. But you can implement some of these strategies throughout a bit more sparingly, I would guess.
So just to jump in,
Yeah.
So I have a lot of high school and elementary educators in my family. And so actually a lot of these methods started in that area. So a lot of the research actually comes out of those grade levels. And now, like Noah said, it totally depends on the administration, how that's going to go. But these are actually great for elementary and high school kids too, for the exact same reasons. I think too much emphasis is put on differences between younger learners and adult learners. I actually think there's much more in common than we think. So, so I think they would be great, and possibly even better because you're starting at a younger age, so they haven't been indoctrinated with these, letter grades as much. But again, you are working a lot with regulation and reporting grades to the state and stuff like that. So there would be some considerations, but it's definitely been done. That's where it really got started, I think.
That is really helpful. I did not know that. That's really helpful to know. So just again, I think the slides are posted, but just for everything I discussed, there's some more resources if you want to read up on those. There's only one for the digital portfolio, but it is really all encompassing. So it's, if you want to take that approach, is super helpful. If you want to stay in touch with PFF, here is the variety of ways you can do so. Email, website, we post blogs, regularly interviews every month. So I think, please feel free to follow. And then just the kind of webinars that are coming up, please take a look, and we hope to see you there. If I will be around if you guys want to keep discussing. But thank you for attending. It was a pleasure.